Hello, my name is David Lee, and thank you for the introduction, and thank you for coming, and thank you for having me. It's interesting because I never in a million years would have thought that I would be here at a naloxone training or co-host one. I think 5-10 years ago, if you had polled all the people in the treatment industry and said, we're going to hold an event and give away free naloxone and overdose drug, I think most of them would have rallied against it, said it was sacrilegious. 10 years ago, this would have been absolutely unheard of. So things are changing. I never in a million years would have imagined that I would be here as well. Earlier today, we had the first naloxone training. We had the DEA that gave a speech, and at the end, it was for professionals, and at the end, they invited people that wanted naloxone kits, which are the anti-overdose drugs, to come up. And even though this was supposed to be for professionals, there was some standing in line that I knew, yes, they were professionals, but they were standing in line for a completely different reason. And the reason I know that is because I've worked with family systems, and I have sat across from that mom and that dad, and I've on the interventions and at Heartland, and they have a look. And there was a handful of people in that line that had the look. And the look is when you go from, my loved one is struggling, but maybe it's a phase. The look goes from when I'm going from denial to I'm grasping at straws. When you are standing in line to pick up a drug that is going to bring your dying or dead kid back to life, you are in a different game. You are in a different stage of life. You are learning a different way to love your child that you never counted on. And there was a handful of them standing in that line that had that look. And I know that look real well. I first got that look in regards to naloxone about 2 or 3 years ago. I do a parent support group and interventions. And doing interventions means I teach families how to set really firm boundaries. Tough love, you can't live here if you're going to keep using drugs. I teach them to not do the slightest thing that would give any kind of acceptance towards drug use. And I'm sitting across from a mom who says to me 3 years ago, you know, Illinois, they're starting to do this overdose drug, David, and my kid has overdosed about 4 times already. And I know it's kind of not tough. I know it's kind of enabling. I know. But I just wanted to run it by you because I want to get it. What do you think? And I looked at this mom, and I knew, I had just a vision that I knew that if I said, I don't know if that's such a good idea, I knew in my heart that a month, 3 months, 6 months, I'm going to be at her kid's funeral. And I would have to reconcile the fact, when she looked me in the eye, that I had something to do with it. So in that moment 3 years ago, I shifted. 4 years ago, if you had asked me, I would have said absolutely not. 3 years ago, I sat across from that mom, and today, here I am standing on this stage. And I think about families, and I think about the ones that have that look. I think about that moment that the families, I'm so grateful that you are here. I know for a fact as a recovering addict myself that the families struggle often more than we do. When I was out ripping and roaring, my mom was up 48 hours, 72 hours, wondering where her kid was, wondering where her car was, wondering where her wallet was. And she felt the consequences of 99% of my lifestyle, and I didn't. She reached the bottom long before I did. It is an honor to stand up here. It's interesting because we're at the Valparaiso, we're at the Memorial Opera House, and I like history. There has been 2 times in the United States history that we have been slaughtered by an opiate epidemic. 2 times. Once is now, and the other time is in the 1890s when this building was being built. It actually had almost the exact same addiction rate in terms of opiates. It is interesting to stand here on this stage knowing that as they built it, there are some things that are different from the 1890s versus today. Number one, there wasn't really a lot of treatment. There was less than 50 treatment facilities. They all advertised themselves as cures, which is interesting. You could go to a place and get the cure, a guaranteed cure. The FDA wasn't really around and they didn't back that kind of stuff up. But if you had $1 bazillion, you could go to Texas. You go on the East Coast, and there were a handful of places that for about 3 to 5 days would give you the cure. What was the cure? Electrotherapy, hydrotherapy, any of this kind of cool, groovy stuff. The thing that was really, really different aside from that is the addicts. In the 1890s, the addicts were predominantly women. Middle to upper middle class women were getting slaughtered. They say, 50 to 60% of the addicts were white middle class to upper middle class women were being slaughtered. And the reason was, we didn't let you in our bars, but we sure as heck offered you laudanum and some other things for your womanly issues. And we marketed it heavily, and you drank it, and you became dependent on it, and we profited off of you. And sooner or later, you became addicted to morphine and laudanum, whatever have you. And I think about this playhouse, this time of being built, and I would guarantee you that there were members of the audience that walked in here, women, that were dependent on opiates and had nowhere to go. And I think about in the 1890s are fascinating. On this stage, John Philip Sousa, like the composer that did all the grand marches, he stood up here and he gave this great old composition, rah, rah. And I think of the dads and the moms of the 1890s because this was women getting slaughtered. So somewhere there was a dad who wanted to invite his daughter here to hear an inspirational band, John Philip Sousa, the great American composer, in the hopes that maybe it would bring his daughter's spark back because she, 27 years old, got on laudanum, morphine. That spark that made her who she was is dying. And he's grasping at straws. So he brings her into a place like this, and they're watching the thing, and he's looking to his right in hopes that he can get a glimmer of the spark. And if you are the parent of an addict, you know that feeling. I don't care if it's dragging them to a church or an inspirational thing, or you're watching the intervention TV show and out of the corner of your eye, you're hoping and praying that maybe they get it. And this guy in the 1890s, I will guarantee you he sat in this audience. And I'm getting some nods so you know what I'm talking about. And he goes home the next day and he wakes up and the thing that he was praying for comes to be. He opens up the newspaper and he sees an advertisement. In 1898, the Bayer Corporation created a miracle drug. And they marketed it. The same year that John Philip Sousa played on this very same stage, Bayer Corporation created a wonderful drug that had no addictive potential and would cure morphine addiction. And he opened up the newspaper and he said, God has delivered me the answer. And he dragged his daughter over to local druggist or pharmacist and he stood in line for the wonder drug, which is heroin. Heroin in 1898 was marketed and sold to cure addiction. It was also marketed and sold for infants to stop them from crying and coughing and things like that. He was grasping at straws and he had that moment of hope and he grasped and heroin came to be. Within 25 years, New York claimed that 95% of all the crimes committed were now done by heroin addicts in 25 years. And here we are. And we don't look at things globally, we look at things now. We are grasping for just about anything that can work. And here we are with naloxone. Naloxone is not a mood-altering substance. You can't take it and get high, so there's some good things. But a lot of us are a little worried sometimes. Is it replacement? Is it this or is it that or is it whatever? Because in 130 years, we haven't done so great with addiction. The title of this workshop is Why People Struggle with Traditional Approaches. Little of my story. I've got my professional side. I started a place founder of Heartland Recovery Center. We're an outpatient program. I also started an intervention company. What are interventions? Real simply, if you ever see me in your living room, either you or somebody in that room is probably going to go to treatment for 28 days. We'll just keep it real simple. Interventions are where we teach families to set boundaries, etc., and usually they go away to treatment. So I have seen thousands of people go to treatment. I myself have been to treatment more than once. And the question, when they give me the look, what did it for you? What's the best one? Which one's going to work? What do you think of Suboxone? What do you think of methadone? What do you think of this naloxone? What do you think of this? What do you think of this church-based program? What do you think of the halfway house? What do you think what's going to work? I think of my mom. My mom showed up and surprised me. She's hiding in the audience right now. I have a mom. My mom did not have the look on my first treatment program. I was 19 years old. I was student council president. The year before, I was who's who among American high school students. And in Griffith, Indiana, at the age of 19, in the 80s, I'm supposedly the first person ever arrested on a heroin charge. In the 80s, it was unheard of to have a little suburban kid arrested on a heroin charge. The cops made a big deal about it. Who are you bringing it in for, kid? You know, the white bear bulb. I'll never talk, coppers. No. I cried, actually. I didn't say I'll never talk. I just cried like a baby. Can I call my mom? My mom had noticed there were changes. I don't like the pathology of addiction. What I mean by that is a lot of times families struggle, and addicts, I hate to use that word, struggle. And the reason I hate it is because the pathology of addiction means addict here, not addict there. And there's a line. And when you create a binary system of either or, it takes families sometimes decades to get over the denial hump that maybe they belong here instead of here. And my family had not gotten over that hump. But one thing they noticed is that I was going through some changes. And anybody that you're connected to with addiction, you'll see the changes. See, you go from the pleasure stage, seeking pleasure and party time and rock and roll David and all that stuff, having a good old time, to the other stage. And the other stage happens really quick. And it's an introverted, you see it in their face. My mom tried to reach out a few times. What's going on with you? It's like you don't talk to me anymore. Things like that. She tried to reach, she sensed a disturbance in the force, like they say in Star Wars. Moms have an instinct, and they don't know how to put their finger on it. When they're teens, like I was, she tried to blame it on maybe it's high school, or maybe it's this or that girl down the road. She sensed something was wrong, but she didn't realize something was wrong until they opened up their bank book and saw hundreds and hundreds of dollars in checks written that they hadn't written. And the reality hit them. Back then there was no internet, there were no options. My mother flipped the back of an insurance card over and called the number. And I was directed to a hospital-based program in Illinois. I don't know if it was the best. I don't know if it was the worst. She didn't know if it was the best. She had heard a couple good things, maybe. There was no internet of 10,000 facilities. And she packed me away and sent me over to my first treatment center. I think of my mother at that time. I think as I left me in the little rehab and my little bags and stuff, as she walked out to the parking lot, put the key in the ignition, maybe took a deep breath, exhaled. And I think of her in that moment, and I wonder how she would have felt if she had known at that moment that that was going to be the first of 25 facilities that I was going to go to. And that is true. I went to 25. My family was not wealthy. My mom was a bartender at the time. In the beginning, my dad had okay insurance up until I was about 21. The other remaining of most of those facilities were state-funded, county-funded facilities. I went through a lot of different places, more than most people. And a huge reason why I'm doing this workshop is because your kids will not live to be through 25. We have a narrow window to get their attention. And most of them will not make it to 25 treatment centers. A lot of it was state-funded, knock on the door of a state-funded facility. Back in the 90s, there was more state-funded, but funding dried up. I guess there was no drug problem, so the funding dried up. It's coming back now, but it fizzled away. 25. And I went to a lot of different types of places. My mother eventually got the look. probably somewhere around the third or the fourth. I don't know if it was the time I carved my wrist open and ended up over at the local facility over here via the psych ward. I don't know if it was that time. I don't know when it was, but sooner or later she got the look. And the look is this going to end? What can we do? And she's grasping at straws and she's trying different things. And I ended up going to a lot of different stuff. So on a personal level, I've been to a lot of different treatment. The bulk of them followed a particular model. The bulk of them were very, very similar. But I went through non-traditional places as well. I converted to Mormonism for a while, and I do remember coming up out of that water wondering, did it work? As I got baptized. And I remember 3 months later wondering why it didn't. I was a Buddhist, a practicing Buddhist for a while. I would meditate for an hour at a time. I had cool little hemp necklaces and groovy dude. I think part of the reason I was into the Buddhism thing is because I was on and off homeless and I had very few possessions, and being a Buddhist with very few possessions goes kind of hand in hand with each other, as people would ask, where's your car? Oh, material things mean nothing to me. Let me tell you a little Zen proverb, and I was kind of groovy. So I was groovy Dave for a while. I did the Buddhist route. I thought if I meditated enough one day, the whispers would go. And sometimes they did and sometimes they didn't. I joined Scientology for a while. I will throw that on my mother. She actually found a Scientology, but she didn't know it was a Scientology program at the time. But she's like grasping at straws, as perhaps some of you in this room are doing. And when you are worried to death and you know that your kid is probably not going to make it if you don't do something drastic, whether that is at 3 in the morning or at noon or on a Sunday. Where's David? He was doing so well. Where's David? So she found this site, and I remember showing up, and I remember calling her going, Mom, this is like a cult. And she said the greatest line in the world. She said, you know what, David? All the drugs you've been doing, your brain is in need of a good washing anyway, and hung up on me. Now I'm going to tell you, your drug problem is getting pretty serious when your mom's happier that you're in a cult than actually on drugs. So I'm just going to say the level upon which my addiction was getting pretty bad. I was a binger, and my binges were getting crazy and psychotic and all this crazy stuff. So I was a practicing Scientologist for a while, which is pretty cool, I guess, or whatever. I was sweating in a sauna, and we would do these drills. We would stare at each other for 8 hours at a time. Why? I don't know. Somewhere around the 15th rehab, you just stop questioning just about everything, and you try just about anything. My 16th year of trying, I convinced my family. I saw a book, and the book talked about a drug that the natives in Africa used that would erase your addiction. And I sat my family down, my brother down, and I said, I think God gave me the answer. Will you lend me the money? I know it sounds crazy. I know it sounds insane. But maybe I got to go across the world because this isn't working. Everything I get, I lose. Every girlfriend I have is 2 months and gone. Every apartment, I'm evicted or it's gone. Every car I trade to a drug dealer. Everything good I get is gone. I'm tired of losing everything. I don't even want to go back to, I just want to quit burning my life to the ground. It took me 18 years to get my first year sober, which means that I was in last place in every support group meeting that I'd ever been to. And every time in the beginning of most of these meetings, they would say, does anybody here have a celebration or a birthday? And somebody would raise their hand and say, today I got 6 years and today I got 4 years. And it was never going to be me. And I was sick. And I'd look at it like, Joe got a year? Joe? How the heck did he get a year? Mom, Kevin, trust me. This is it. And I literally, with money my family lent me, got on a plane and went to Gabon, West Africa. And that sounds crazy. Don't think my family's wealthy. They didn't. They borrowed the money and scraped it together for a one-shot deal. that maybe, just maybe, and if you don't think that you are going to pull money out of your back pocket to send your kid to Africa after they've been to 17 or 18 or 19 or 22 different facilities, and the relapses are getting so crazy, I kicked down the door of a hotel desk clerk because the TV told me he was in on the conspiracy. I held him at knife point while I dialed 911 because I needed them to come rescue me from the murderers. And when the cops showed up, I knew that he wasn't a cop. I knew that he was a hitman there to kill me, and I just was praying to can I grab his gun? So my relapses are not okay, and they're seeing it. And they are deathly afraid. And if you've seen your kid overdose or do something crazy, party time is over. I went to Africa. I took a drug that in some cases erases addiction. And I got to lay on a mat while seeing visions and demons and wonderful things. And the kid to my left came there for some pot addiction. I think he never smoked weed again after that. 4 months later, when I got home, I'm on the south side of Chicago, ripping and roaring, and my family's making it very clear they are done with me. So, I've been through a lot of different things. More importantly, my family has been through a lot of different things. So I'm going to talk a little bit about why people struggle with traditional approaches. Now understand, I am a member of Traditional Approach. I teach a non-traditional approach, which is interesting. You would think, wouldn't I teach the thing that I am? I am a staunch member of Traditional Recovery. I am a member. It's who I am. It's part of what I do. So why would I stand up here and teach a non-traditional approach? Why would I do that? Why would I do that? Because I'm going to tell you one thing that I've kind of learned having worked in treatment for many years, having worked with a lot of different treatment centers, having seen different models, different approaches. Every place I ever went, Scientology, Buddhism, Mormonism, even Africa, the harm reduction group, all the different stuff, they all had two things in common. Two things that they had in common. The one was, I found people that found sobriety in each of them. And the thing that they had in common, those people that had found sobriety, is they passionately believed in their program of recovery. Whether they were in Celebrate Recovery and praying to Jesus, whether the atheist over here. And they so intently believed and they had found their way. That's one of the things. The second thing, and I got to be real careful on how I say this, the second thing is the majority of the people that I found in these systems knew in their heart that all the other ones were wrong. And it sounds like a controversial statement. You will hear people that will say, oh, different things work for different people. They say it, but they do not mean it. I have been in many different models and different approaches, and when I sat there in the Mormon group, they were very, very clear that AA watered it down, the God concept, and it was not really the right way, that they had found the way, and they knew it to be the main way and the only way, and they knew it to be so. And when you sit in the AA meeting, they may look at the NA people as okay or whatever it is, but deep inside they really know what the answer is, which is the AA meeting. And if you doubt me, go to the NA meeting and ask them about what the AA is like. And if you doubt me, go to Smart Recovery. And all these different people have found success. The problem, though, is, are we really okay with different paths? And in my experience, when you really get down to it, they are not. If you doubt me, if there are anybody here from a traditional approach, and I am, I'm going to give you a suggestion. Go to your local AA, Smart Recovery, Celebrate Recovery, and go to your meeting and say this. All of you, I've been with you for many, many years, and I want to thank you for all the wonderful help that you have given me. But now I've decided to move on to a different phase of my recovery, and I will no longer be attending this support group. I will be immersing in church. Thank you all. Now you tell me, will they applaud at this phase of your recovery, or will they snicker amongst themselves as they know that you're making the wrong decision? That's what they do. And it's not a bad thing, but it's something that we need to acknowledge. That unfortunately, those of us that have been given the gift of recovery often are biased against all others, which is okay unless I work in treatment and your 19-year-old is sitting across from me. And I know that all other paths but mine are wrong. So, why do people struggle with traditional treatment approaches? Again, I'm a member of traditional. It may sound like I am knocking it, but I am not. I am going to approach this from the eyes of a 19-year-old, because I was once a 19-year-old in my first treatment program. To give you a little bit of background on that moment, we were the Lee brothers. My brother and I was the long-haired rock and roll. We threw the keg parties at the high school. We were the house you were not allowed to come to. Sorry, Mom, the truth is coming out. You were working at night and we threw parties. If you didn't know that by now, we did. My brother and I would throw big old parties. I drank at the age of 15, 16. I drank a lot. Sometimes drank daily. We drank. When I was 16 years old, there was a 14-year-old girl that drank so much Jack Daniels at one of our parties that she was hospitalized with alcohol poisoning and almost died. The police wanted to chat with me. They apparently were not thrilled about that. We threw parties. We were raided a couple times by the police. We drank. My mother had kind of a philosophy, which is not necessarily a bad one. She had young people that she knew that would drink and drive as kids and die. And she said, well, you know what? I'd rather you stayed here. I'm not approving it, but it's better than you drinking and dying. I was 17 years old. I drank so much and flipped my car over, or shall I say her car, going about 100 miles an hour. I broke my leg. My girlfriend almost died. I'm in the hospital. I get a minor intox. By the time I'm 19, I have about 4 or 5 drinking-related episodes. But in my family, like many families, drinking is pretty socially acceptable. And it's a phase. It was assumed that sooner or later we would drink. Drinking is just kind of who many people are. So a lot of that stuff that you see, they weren't really that alarmed with, and I encounter this with families a lot. But when you open up your checkbook and you realize that your son has stolen hundreds of dollars from you for a cocaine issue, it's a whole different game. In the 80s, there was the crack cocaine epidemic, and there was this really big say no to drugs campaign, say no to crack cocaine, and they did this big old push. And when they saw that, they're like, oh my God, my son's addicted to cocaine, it's big trouble, all this stuff. So I'm going to tell you, when they said, let's go to rehab, I don't want you to get the impression that I didn't think I had a drug problem. I knew there's a moment in all of your loved one's life, or those of you that have done drugs or whatever, a moment in our early addiction when it goes from Party Dave to not. And it is a psychological blow that I cannot begin to describe. When you realize that you have lost control over something, and cocaine had me pretty quick. I would say I'm not going to use on this Friday, I'm just going to go to a little party and then I would be fiending for it and come home at 1 in the morning and hope my mom was asleep so I could steal some money and go get $20 worth of cocaine from her, something that I had swore I would never touch again. There comes a point that the fun party time is gone. And at 19, it was already gone pretty quick. So when they approached me, I was somewhat relieved. I didn't think like I should be able to use cocaine for the rest of my life. I wasn't an idiot, nor are most 19-year-olds that I encounter. So when they whisked me away to treatment, I was a guy who had been drinking almost daily, drinking all the time. I had about 4 or 5 different drinking episodes. But I did not think I had a drinking issue. I knew in my heart that I had a cocaine issue, and I arrived at Ingalls Memorial, I think, which is a hospital, which is actually a really good hospital. And it was a hospital-based program, and unbeknownst to me at the time, unbeknownst to my mom, unbeknownst to anybody, the hospital-based programs back in the 80s, about 90% of them were all the same. 90% of treatment programs were all the same. They were all what was referred to as a Minnesota model of treatment and recovery. That was not on the front door. It was not on the pamphlet. It just was. What is a Minnesota model? A Minnesota model came about in the 40s and the 50s, where they decided to take a combination of a hospital-based program, medical, perhaps medication, do psychoed, teach you about alcohol's effects on the brains, and combine it with a 12-step farm at the time in Minnesota. And they created what is now the Minnesota model of treatment and recovery. Is a combination of 12-step principles, disease model education, or the medical model, as well as therapy. And they all are mostly the same. They have very similar schedules. When I encounter now, unfortunately, a 25-year-old, most of them have been to treatment 4 or 5 times. And when you ask them, they're like, oh, I went to a place in Texas, and I went to a place here, and I went to a place here. And when you ask them, they're all pretty much the same. And it's interesting that even though the landscape has changed, even though the age limit has dropped, that the treatment has stayed mostly the same. Minnesota model, I'm not here to bash any particular treatment programs, but I'm going to tell you a trap that we got into. And the trap with the Minnesota model is we created a system of one size fits all. And what do I mean by that? I mean your 19-year-old who arrives in a 28-day facility, and understand I own treatment, and I put people in treatment. But the facts are, your 19-year-old sitting in treatment who is sitting exactly next to the 75-year-old will get the exact same program as the 75-year-old alcoholic. They will sit in the exact same groups, and it will rotate every 28 days. The Minnesota model was different than what had come before. Before, it was individualized care, which is really expensive. What is individualized care? It means that I'm going to hook you up with a doctor and a therapist, and we're going to work on you independently, and we're going to migrate through this process, and when you're ready to go, we're going to send you home. A 28-day program actually is a little different, because what it was is it allowed us to treat 40 people at a time, just rotating. And I know many people that the first day of treatment, they learned about step 7, and tomorrow was step 8, and then 9, and it rotates, and you nod because you know. And most people who have been in treatment know exactly what I'm talking about. It's a rotating, revolving system. So, 19-year-old long-haired rock and roll David shows up on his first day of treatment. He knows he has a cocaine problem. He wished it would go away. I meet the first requirement. I know I have a problem. I meet the second requirement. I want to do something about it. And I meet the third is I'm willing to make it go away, right? And a few things that I remember from that first experience as we wheeled, well, they didn't have wheels back then. I dragged my suitcase, or mom's suitcase, into treatment is I hadn't gone to like summer school or any of those kind of things, or like, growing up. So like other friends went to college, I had done a little bit of local college, but I had never gone anywhere. So they whisked me away to my room, and my room has 2 beds in it, one of which is not really made. And I realized I have like a roommate, another dude that is next to me, which is a little weird, but I was cool with it. And they handed me a schedule. One thing that stood out to me in this first treatment experience, and again, this is not to bash, this is to introduce you to what a 19-year-old experienced in 1989, who did not agree that he had a drinking problem, who knew in his heart he had a cocaine issue. And understand that the program that I got, everybody else got the exact same one. So my program was not unique. One of the first things that stood out to me is they took away my books. I like to read fantasy and science fiction, and they said, you can't have these. And I was like, why? And they go, because you're only allowed to have a Bible or recovery-related literature. You can't have any of those books. And I thought it was a little weird. Okay, I like to read. I'm a little irritated. Okay, that's cool. And I read the schedule, and the first thing that stood out to me was that you had to get up at like 6 a.m. Now understand, when you are a drinking everyday cocaine user, long-haired rock and roll David, getting up at 6 a.m. isn't really a part of your lifestyle. Going to bed at 6 a.m. is a little more. So I was a little iffy on that. I had hoped they'd give me a few days kind of a break, but they didn't, which is whatever. And in the mornings, they had what is called morning meditation. Now, morning meditation, for those of you that were around in the 80s, is not meditation. I thought it was. I was really, really excited. And what morning meditation was is they would pass around a book, the reflections or the 24-hour day book, and they would read the thought of the day. The thought of the day would be, today I'll reflect on my alcoholism, or whatever have you. I attend morning meditation, and I began to sit in groups. If you've never been to treatment, I'll give you a little bit of kind of what it's like, a day in the life. It's almost like a school. there are little groups, and well, now it's a whiteboard, but it was a blackboard back then. You will watch films, educational films. You will learn about alcohol's effects on the brain. And you will participate in didactic or educational or psychoeducational groups. What are some of the groups that a 19-year-old long-haired rock and roll David who knows he has a cocaine problem and does not agree he has an alcohol problem? I learned for the first time that I had a disease. And I'm not here to argue disease, not, yes, no, any of that stuff. I will tell you what 19-year-old long-haired David hears and what most 19-year-old heroin addict guys hear when they hear the word disease is like, what? Like hold up, wait, what? And I was science-minded. And they showed me and they explained that the AMA had declared a disease, or the APA, or whatever have you, and it was a brain disorder. And actually in the 80s, they actually declared addiction as a disease. Back in, the 50s, it was alcohol. And they're like, showing me all this evidence, but I was like, that doesn't make sense to me. I didn't hear me in it. It didn't seem like you're saying I inherited it. I caught it from my mom. Are you saying that I didn't have it, and then when I used, I got it? Wait, you're saying I get it for life? That doesn't make sense to me. Like, just help me to get, it just doesn't make sense. I'm going to give you a secret. You will never work a solution to a problem that you think you don't have. And one of the first challenges in treatment when you have a 19-year-old is you have a small window to catch their attention. And whether the disease model is right or wrong isn't the point. If he doesn't believe in it, you better approach it from a different angle, because he will not live long enough to realize you are right or wrong. And I'm speaking from a former 19-year-old's perspective. And I argued my point, and they dismissed it, and it is what it is. And I learned a couple other things, because a portion of a Minnesota model is heavy abstinence-based. I work an abstinence-based program of recovery today. What is abstinence-based? It means there's no drugs or anything. And I remember kind of casually mentioning, I was there for a cocaine issue, and I remember casually mentioning that, man, when I get out of here, I'm going to have a couple beers. Anybody that's ever never been in treatment, don't say I'm going to have a couple beers when I get out of rehab. It does sound kind of nutty. And they said, well, you can't do that. And I go, well, what do you mean? And they go, well, you can't do nothing. And I said, nothing? And like, nothing. You're an addict. And I go, yeah, but I'm not here for drinking. Like, look in my file. Look in the file, right? And they're like, no, you can't do nothing. And I'm not telling you that I'm encouraging a 19-year-old to drink. I'm telling you what a 19-year-old who has found himself in the grips of opiate addiction will hear when you blast him with you're an addict and everything is off. Because when I said, what you're saying I can't smoke weed? No, you can't smoke weed. But why? Because you're an addict. But I'm not an addict to weed. You're an addict, you can't use any. But yeah, but nothing? Like you're saying I'm like, sell my butt on the corner for a bag of weed, like I'll go crazy? You just can't do nothing. And it didn't make sense to me, and it doesn't make sense. Why? I came here for cocaine, please help me. And I raised my hand, and they're like, David, what? How come we can drink coffee and smoke cigarettes? Yesterday's group, you said nicotine is a stimulant and coffee is a stimulant, and I'm here for stimulants. According to your thing, I should be like addicted. I should be gallons of coffee. And they're like, it's different. How is it different? It just is. And I'm struggling and I'm trying. I am there because I know there's a problem. I'm not an idiot. One of the biggest mistakes that people make is they assume that if the kid didn't make it, it's because he wasn't willing. There is a difference between unwilling and not agreeing. And I'm not saying I was right. I'm not encouraging that a 19-year-old go out and smoke weed, but there were flaws, and I couldn't. Help me to understand it. Help me to get it. I'm not understanding, and I am struggling with this. If they had told me, if they said, David, the reason you're addicted to cocaine is because you're conditioned to associate it with a good pleasure, and now we're going to do an experiment. Every time you think of cocaine, we're going to whack you upside the head. That kind of would have made sense to me. And I'm sitting in groups and I'm watching cocaine's effects on the brain. I'm trying to wait for the moment. The moment, the hurrah. Okay, David, it's time for your AA meeting. Line up. AA meeting? I'm not an alcoholic. Yeah, David, but it's on the schedule. Everybody goes. Yeah, but I'm not an out. Is there like a cocaine? No, everybody goes. And a huge component to a Minnesota model, especially in the 80s, is we all lined up for an AA meeting, whether you were there for heroin, alcohol, or other. I tried to argue my point, but they were not going to let me stay in my room. And I showed up at my very first AA meeting. I am a member of traditional recovery. I'm not bashing, but I'm going to tell you what it is like for a 19-year-old who was pushed into a meeting that, quite honestly, he probably didn't belong in at that moment. It is not controversial for me to say that. We are a program of attraction rather than promotion. And 19-year-old David sat in his first AA meeting. I'm going to tell you a little more about 19-year-old David. I did not have a faith at that moment in my life. And not only did I not have a faith, I was the arguing atheist. The only thing I knew about church, I had been one time, a bunch of dude friends of mine said you should go to midnight mass because you could drink, like have a little wine or something with the friends. So I went. It was kind of cool, I guess, but you stood up and sit down. It was like the Catholic thing, right? It was a lot going on. It was colorful. It was kind of cool. Did not have a faith at the time. My term papers my senior year were creationism versus evolution, science versus religion. So when I say I was atheist, I was a level 9 atheist. There was a group of Christian kids that used to go to the school, and I think you get extra points for converting the long-haired rock and roll dude, because they would try to get me to go to church a lot. I have a faith today. I'm telling you where I, the 19-year-old David, was in my first AA meeting. If you've never been to an AA meeting, especially one in treatment, I'm going to tell you how it goes. And I am a member. I'm a loving member. I love, but I belong there. A 19-year-old might not have. I'll explain why. I sat at my first meeting, a couple people come in, it's called H&I, and they bring a couple books and things like that, and they set them down. They ask a few people to read. They said, let's start this meeting off with a moment of silence followed by the serenity prayer. I had known nothing about no prayer. Anybody, you know the serenity prayer? God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, the wisdom to know the difference. Okay. I've asked another member to read the 24-hour day booklet. If you know anything about the 24-hour day booklet, it's a black book. It is broken down into 3 different paragraphs. Each day is different. Day to day, I will reflect on my alcoholism thought of the day, followed by the prayer for the day. I pray that God will relieve me of this alcoholism, followed by the meditation for the day. I will think on my alcoholism and how God can help me, right? I'm in a hospital. I just got done watching the scientific effects of cocaine in the brain, and we're like praying and stuff. And I'm not here to bash that program, but I'm going to tell you where your 19-year-old might hear. I ask kids all the time that land in my program, you ever been to recovery before? They say, oh yeah, I've been to like 50 AA meetings, I've been here and there. I'm like, AA means you an alcoholic? Oh no, they make us go. We need to reevaluate what we're doing. 19-year-old David sits. The next thing they do, and they do it in every single meeting, is they will read a portion of chapter 5 called How It Works. And if you've never been to an AA meeting, I'll give you the quick version. Rarely have we seen a person fail as thoroughly and followed our path, and they will read a few paragraphs. There's a few that will stand out when you're an atheist. If you're an atheist or as atheistic as I was, as are some of the 19-year-olds that I've crossed paths with, you hear the word God louder than everybody else. For you, it might be a comfortable blessing to hear the word God, not for 19-year-old long-haired, rebellious rock and roll David, staunch atheist that I was. There is one who has all power. That one is God. May you find him now. Him is capitalized, so I know exactly who they're talking about. They're not talking about the lowercase him, the uppercase him. Here are the steps we took, and they will rattle off the various steps. Step 2 being, step 1 talks about powerlessness. Step 2 came to believe that a power greater than ourselves could restore us to sanity. Step 3 made a decision to turn our will and our lives to the care of God, as we understood him, capital God, capital him. Steps 5, we'll skip 4. Step 5, admitted to God, to ourselves, and another human being, the exact nature of our wrongs. Step 6, we're entirely ready to have God remove our shortcomings, right? Our defects. Step 7, humbly asked him, capital him again, to remove our defects, right? Steps 11, sought through prayer and meditation to improve our conscious contact with God, as we understood and praying only for knowledge of His will for us and the power to carry that out. Step 12, having had a spiritual awakening or experience, as the result of these steps, we tried to carry this message to alcoholics and to practice these principles in all our affairs. If you've ever been to a meeting, they will continue reading at the end. They read the same thing. It's 3 lines, that there were 3 things. A, that we were alcoholic and could not manage our own lives. B, that probably no human power could have relieved our alcoholism. And C, that God could and would if He ever saw it. And when they say that line, they chant it, and she just did right in front of me. Because you can tell who the member of recovery is. They can't help it. And if you've ever been to an AA meeting, the first time you hear that chant, it's a little much. And I don't know what the heck they talked about at that meeting, but I do know what happened at the end of that meeting. At the end of the meeting, they did what they do at almost every single meeting, is they did the Lord's Prayer. They linked hands, and the Lord's Prayer is a level 9 prayer, Our Father. And Jesus spoke from the mountaintop, Our Father. We pray like this, Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, right? And I left that meeting, my first meeting. And at that time, that program, just like 90% of all the others, had one treatment plan for all of us. When you leave here, go to 90 AA meetings in 90 days. Get a sponsor and work the steps. And I told Mike, the therapist there, when I left that meeting, I said, Mike, that was like a religious thing. And he said, no, it's not. And I said, well, that one was. He said, no, it's not. You don't have to believe. Mike, man, I know what you're doing, man. Like, they said God like everything, and they handed me a big book, and they said, highlight everything you can relate to, and they set me off in a little room, and I highlighted nothing because it was written in the 30s, and I couldn't find anything. And I'm not hearing me. I'm not hearing me. About 3 weeks into that program, I'm brought into the executive director's office, and she says that they are going to begin the discharge procedures on me because I am too argumentative. I am a detriment to other people's recovery. I am hijacking the groups. And I didn't call them. They didn't call me. I called them. I apparently don't want what they have. And I was stunned because I thought it was like a school. I thought you like debate and you're trying to figure, maybe I was more of a jerk than I remember. Maybe I was a little bit outgoing and stuff. Maybe, but man, and I don't know if they were really doing it, going to kick me out, or just a treatment thing. And I went to bed that night tossing and turning, thinking about my mom. Because I'm now the first kid in my entire high school who's ever been to rehab. And there's only one loser who's worse than going to rehab, is the kid who gets kicked out of rehab. And I woke up that next morning and I asked for another shot. I begged him for another shot, and I was given another shot. And at the end of that program, 45 days later, the clients would all vote you something. Most changed, most spiritual, most this. I was voted the most likely to stay sober. And I've been voted most likely to stay sober on all 25 facilities I ever went to. Something happened to me in that moment when I went to bed that night. I may have been a jerk, but at least I was an authentic jerk. And I woke up the next morning and I learned how to say the right things and not the real things. And I began practicing the right things. And I do own a first edition AA book, and I can quote it backwards and forwards, and I know the histories better than just about anybody you know, and I know all the right things to say. And I'm always voted to be the client in charge or the assistant director of the local halfway house because everyone looks at me and I say the right things. And I have sat across from the 19-year-old who knows everything to say, and he is dying on the inside. And you think he's full of crap? He is not full of crap. He's trying desperately to figure his way out. And they'll say, fake it till you make it. I faked it, and I got really, really good at it. And I would raise my hand in the meetings and say, I'd like to talk about acceptance today, because I had heard a bazillion other people bring up that topic, and I am dying. You know what I want to say? Why do you get it? What am I doing wrong? Why do you get it? I worked 10 times harder at this than you did. Why? Hi, my name's David. I'd like to talk about acceptance today. And I am great at the right things and not the real things. And I lost my authenticity. And it wasn't that I was full of it, and it's not that your loved one is. They are trying to figure out a way. Maybe if we just hang around and stumble your way through it. You have to find what you believe in. And I got really good at working on what you believed in. They say meeting makers make it. I went to 1,000 meetings my first year in California and only relapsed 3 times, which means that somewhere in that first year, I knew in my heart that, at least for David, meeting makers don't necessarily stay sober. And I didn't find my thing. And everybody that I've ever met that has found sobriety has found a thing that they believe in. Whether it is right or wrong is what they believe in. Different people, everyone in this room has a model of recovery. My family had a model. They had a way of looking at it. My mother, who's sitting in this room right now, she didn't know these terms, but she had a way of looking at the problem and she had a way of looking at the solution. Moms, like many moms, are very friendly to a therapeutic approach. Therapy is a solution, and she would sometimes drop hints because moms are sneaky. David, Aunt Edna started seeing a therapist, and it really helped her. Would you be okay with seeing a therapist? Maybe if I talked to the right person, because I wasn't talking to her anymore, that maybe something happened. David, did something happen when you were a kid? Did the baby? I mean, you can tell me. And she knew in her heart, if she put me in front of the right person, we would have the breakthrough, like Robin Williams in Good Will Hunting. It's not your fault. We would hug and cry, and we would have a breakthrough. And she would nudge. She didn't know she was a believer in a therapeutic model, that maybe some things in the past we could talk about and overcome. Moms are real friendly to that. My mom was also a believer in treatment as a model. Even though I had been to 1,000,000, she knew in her heart that somewhere out there was the right place for a guy like me. And she tried to do everything, and she put more effort into my recovery than I ever did, and she tried and tried and tried. My mom, at one point, was a fan of the medical model. She didn't know these terms. A medical model that I'm like all over the place. I've got depression, bipolar, I'm up, I'm down, I'm psychotic, I'm crazy. David, maybe it's something else going on. Maybe he has bipolar, maybe he has anxiety, maybe underlying. And moms are sneaky. David, you know, I know it's different, but I used to smoke cigarettes. And I took that Wellbutrin, and I quit in like a week. And I know it's different. Would you be willing to try some Wellbutrin? No, Mom, I don't want to try that stuff. You'll smoke crack, but you won't take Wellbutrin? No, Mom, I've got my convictions. Dads, my dad was not a fan of therapy as a model. Oh, you have issues? My dad was not a fan of treatment. Somewhere on the second or third, he knew that treatment was a bust. My dad is not a fan of the medical model. My dad, like many dads, is a fan. His belief system is the get a damn job and quit doing drugs model of addiction and recovery, and there's nothing you can say to convince him. Go to your damn meetings, go to your rehabs, do whatever it is, but he knows because he used to drink a lot, and one day he just quit. My dad has a 2-step program of recovery. If you want to know what it is, it's actually pretty cool. Step 1, you got to pick a date that you're going to quit. You got to pick that date. Step 2, on that date, you just quit drinking, and every time you think about having a drink, you tell yourself, don't pick up that drink, and that's it, 2-step program. He's been working it for 20 years, been sober ever since. Don't go to AA or church or none of that stuff. My brother has a punitive outlook or a consequential outlook. You know when people have that outlook, whether they know the term or not, which is he hasn't reached his bottom yet. You guys got to quit enabling him. You got to quit enabling. You're the problem. And you'll hear that when they reach the bottom. When he suffers enough, when you throw him out, when he hits his bottom, then he'll change. He's looking at my family going, what the heck's wrong with you guys? And then there's my grandma, of course, who had a faith. You should come to church. Because my grandma knew that if I were willing to accept Jesus Christ as my personal Savior and let him in, it would fix everything. She had seen miracles in church. My aunt had the same thing. My aunt actually has the prayer list with my name on it on her window. She takes all the credit for actually, she gives it to God. In my family, we had all these different models, different ways of looking at it, and whether they believed it, but there's mine. What did I believe in? What does your 19-year-old believe in? And if they don't find that thing to believe in, And if they go in a one-size-fits-all and we ram them in and say, fake it till you make it, they will never find that thing. So what was it for me? People ask that all the time. Which one did it? Which one was it? All of them? None of them? I can tell you a moment where I found my moment. I'm in a halfway house in Chicago for the second time. I had been there a year before, and I had committed to a 6-month stay. But the year before, a job opportunity came up after a month, and I bailed because I always bail. Nobody gets me for more than a couple months. Whether you're a girlfriend or a job or an apartment or a treatment center, everybody gets 2 months of David before I get restless, irritable, and discontent and find a different way. And I'm back at the exact same treatment center, halfway house, and I'm sitting there, and at this point, I'm pretty much done. I'm in my 18th year of trying, and I'm going to meetings and all this stuff, and I'm stumbling along, and I got this roommate. His name was Bill. Bill was a lawyer and a real estate developer who had decided to put his practice on hold so that he could focus on his sobriety. He had been there for 2 years. He had 2 years sober. I have big lawyer Bill, who I heard was wealthy. And sometimes people would point out in Chicago, look at that building that used to be Bill's. I mean, big money. And I couldn't understand it. I was like, Bill, why are you still here? And he would say, nothing is more important to my sobriety, which is a stupid thing to hear when you're, like, you don't want to hear that dude. 2 years, Bill? What, really? Like, you on the run? Nothing is so important. So, right. So I'm there for about a month, and I'm restless, irritable, and discontent. But when I get restless, irritable, and discontent, I don't know I am. I just know that you guys are a bunch of jerks. And I looked around that halfway house. I was so grateful. Let me in again. And I knew what the problem was. And it wasn't me. It was them. I just didn't like their style. I didn't like the way they dealt with things. They were giving me crap. You know what the manager did? The manager of that place? He was cool a year ago, but you know what he was doing to me? You get chores, even though you're a grown man. And every Saturday, I got the toilet chore. You're supposed to get different chores. And every Saturday, David, you get the toilet. I'm like, seriously? So I just know that I got to go somewhere better. I'm not going to use. Bill said something to me that I had never heard. He said to me, do you know why you'll never stay sober? Now, I immediately got a little defensive at that because I've heard some variation of this my whole life. Oh, you didn't do a thorough enough 4-step. You didn't have the right sponsor. You didn't get into service work. You didn't do this. You didn't do that. You didn't do whatever. You're only a sick. I've heard every variation of you know what your problem is. And Bill said, you know why you'll never stay sober? And I said, why? He said, because you're not even addicted to drugs or alcohol. Now, only a drug addict will get offended when somebody accuses them of not being addicted to drugs and alcohol. And I began to argue with him, and I said, Bill, I'm worse than you are. I know your story. I've been to 25 It was a big dude, so I didn't want to fight him. But it was like that. And because he was a lawyer, and I had this idea, and I respected him, what do you mean? He said, you're not even addicted. You know what you're really addicted to? And I said, what? He said, you're addicted to avoiding uncomfortable feelings, things, and situations, and it dictates every single move you make, and I've been watching you for years. He said, you're an expert at feeling better, and you suck at getting better, because for you to get better, you got to do some uncomfortable things. He said, I watch you. You know what? You sit by the pretty girl in the meeting. You don't sit by the uncomfortable dude. Everything you do, you go to coffee instead of a 4-step. You don't commit to these requirements. All these things. And I heard me, and I had had enough wreckage, and I didn't hear it when they gave that lecture and said you have a disease, and I didn't hear it when they said you're an alcoholic or I didn't hear it when they said X, Y, and I didn't hear it when the therapist said you had trauma, and I didn't hear it. I just didn't, and I'm not saying I was right or wrong, I'm just saying you have to find yours. I was addicted to avoiding, and I looked back on my life, and it just made sense to me. And he said to me, I'm going to give you a suggestion. Just do the uncomfortable parts of recovery and watch what happens. And I went to bed that next night, and I woke up the next day, and I apologized to that manager, and I volunteered for the crappiest job because I thought, what if he was true? And it just kind of made sense. And I made a commitment to do the uncomfortable parts of recovery. And I got a jerk of a sponsor, and I sat, instead of the pretty girl at the meeting, there was this guy named John. John had 50 years sober, and he was a jerk. Everybody hated John. If you went to a crowded meeting, it was standing room only, except for 2 chairs around John. Nobody wanted, that's how bad he was. He was obnoxious and a jerk, and I started sitting next to John. And I made a commitment that I would just do the uncomfortable parts. And I know where I was at a year later when I got to stand for the first time on a Saturday at 11 o'clock a.m. after 18 years of trying and say, my name is David, and I got a year today. And I was standing next to John. And I have done the uncomfortable parts, and I have stayed clean and sober ever since. And I'm not saying this is the magic bullet for your loved ones. The magic bullet is that we, as providers, need to guide the kid, the loved one, the husband or the wife, for him to find his moment. And when he finds the thing to believe in, whether it's meeting makers make it, or if you do a thorough enough work, or smart recovery, or celebrate recovery, or this or that, or getting into service, if you can empower and give them their magic thing, miracles happen. I have seen it worked for my dad. Get a damn job and just quit. It worked for the Scientologists and the Mormons, the AA members and the NA and the smart recovery. It works for them all. But if you don't find that thing to believe in, traditional treatment works really, really well for those that fit there. The reason many people struggle is because we try to ram a square peg into our round hole until eventually he just starts acting like a round peg. And he doesn't fit. Let us find what works. We are here at an naloxone training. And the thing is what I challenge clients to do all the time, the recovery is in the uncomfortable. And when I work with families, I say if you want your loved one to step outside of their comfort zone, then you need to start stepping outside of yours. And what I tell treatment providers, it's time that we stepped outside of our comfort zone. Can I truly, legitimately help somebody to find their path when their path has nothing to do with mine? I love my program. I teach this avoidance coping and all that stuff, but it's right for me. Sometimes when I talk to a client, their eyes gloss all over and it doesn't make sense. But I have had many a 19-year-old that has been to 5 treatment centers that I've sat across from, and I have used that line. You're addicted to avoiding uncomfortable feelings, things, and it dictates your every move. And the light bulb turns on, and he says, now I know what's wrong with me. And it is the greatest gift in the world. So it's not that traditional treatment doesn't work. It works phenomenally for those that it fits. And different things work for different people, and I truly mean that. It is our responsibility to guide them along the way, even if it is uncomfortable for us to do that. So, I apologize for the heat. I told them to turn it up a little bit. I just wanted to, no, I'm just kidding. Thank you so much for having me. Thank you for having all of us here. I know that we've got the naloxone training, which is very cool. I sat through it earlier today. It is an absolute honor, and I'm going to end with this. Every May 1st, I get the honor of standing up and getting another year sober, another token. And everybody calls me. Congratulations. And I get to stand up on Facebook. Nobody calls my mom, the one who worked 10 times harder for my sobriety than I ever did. Nobody calls my brother, who's sitting right there, who on his wedding day, when he came back from his honeymoon, found that when he gave his brother the key to his home to watch it, as he carried his wife over the threshold, realized that I had robbed him of his wedding money. Nobody calls him, who 3 months later was pulling money out of his 401k in the off chance that it could afford to pay for a little detox to help save his brother's life. Nobody calls my stepdad, who every time he forgot to lock the closet, I robbed him. And nobody calls my ex-wife, who wanted to know what was so important with them and it, that I chose that every single time. Our families suffer more than we do. And it's cool that I get to stand up here, the rags to riches story. I lived under a bridge, and I found all this stuff in 25 rehabs. But the real heroes are you guys and the family that is sitting there. So the greatest thing in the world that I get to do is on May 1st, I get to get a token. But after May 1st is Mother's Day. And on last Mother's Day, I got to do, like I did the year before and the year before and the year before, is I get to give that woman a sobriety token because she worked her ass off for it. And I like to say that it took me 18 years to get my first year. It took my family over there 18 years for me to get my first year because they worked harder for it than I ever did. And I honor you that have come here, the families and friends of addicts and the addicts as well, because I know the secret. I know that you have probably put more work in on our recovery than we ever did. So thank you very much for coming here. It has been an honor. So.